Okay, folks. So where we came from was we had managed to get commas into our data, getting it looking a little bit more like the data in our Google visualization sample, but not quite. We still want it to be. We still need to make it an array of arrays. So as I mentioned in the last video, there's a handy tool that was made by a fellow named Shan Carter, who works at the New York Times. And the thing I really like about this is not only is it super useful, but it also illustrates the fact that there are lots of different data types, or things that sound like data types, like CSV and TXT and TSV and all of these things, and they're all just text, and they can all be transformed from one into the other. And this just actually does it for you automatically, which is really handy, because otherwise it can be a huge pain. The one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't add commas to things that are separated by spaces, so that's why we had to do that interim step. So the default, as you can see here, is it says JSON properties. That's something we've seen before. So if we look at it, we see it's an array of objects, because that is the, if we see there the curly braces, but we want it to be. So here it says row arrays, and if we choose row arrays, we can see this actually looks really, really close to the data that we have in our file here, which is awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and take this, copy this out of Mr. Data Converter. I'm going to be very, very careful, right, to make sure that I get all the bits of my stuff here, and say, boom, I'm going to put that in there. And if I am lucky, this should actually just render in my file. Ta-da! Pretty awesome, right? So this is what we like to call, or we tend to call, quick and dirty, right? I needed some data, I found some data, I got it together, everything looks really straightforward. So this is great, except in order to get this to work, we had to go through several steps. And, I had to find the data, I had to download the data, I had to, put it into Excel, put it into text file, and then put it into Excel, and then put it through Mr. Data Converter, and then copy it in, and lots of places for things to go wrong. Lots of steps to do. Again, not the biggest deal if you're doing this maybe once a month, but if you're doing it once a week, right? Especially if it's once a week and then one day you're on vacation and somebody else has to do it and you have to explain it, right? So these are all the things that we think about in a newsroom where nothing is ever done once. Nothing is ever done once. And so ideally we want to find a way that we can sort of both streamline this process, make it a bit simpler, a bit smoother, involve fewer manual steps, and maybe even keep itself updated in the long run, so that we don't even have to touch it. So how are we going to do this? Well, this sort of comes back to why we looked at things like loops and conditionals last week. So first of all, I want to point out that this is a really ugly way to have our data in here. I've got this huge whole chunk of data, and as you guys have seen, I'm messing around file to file, just one thing goes wrong and kablooey, right? I moved one comma got deleted, and like the whole page stops working, right? Not an ideal situation. So what I want to do is find something that is going to be a little bit more reliable and involve fewer steps. So in order to do that, I'm very lucky. In this case, we're very lucky because the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so again, I added back my comma, everything's fine, has this awesome thing. It has the St. Louis Fed has something called the FRED API, and I'm just going to Google for it here. And if I come here, and again, I'll show this to you. It's a little bit weird the way that the way that you find things, but this is actually the same data. This is it in XML format. You may remember this from our brief introduction to it in class. And here we have it in JSON, okay? And one of the things that we can do, which we will look at in a moment, or we'll actually probably look at next week, is that we can actually load this just directly from a URL, as Joanna has showed us in previous weeks, kind of how we can do this. For now, all I'm gonna worry about is actually just the fact that if I wanted to load this data directly, right, I can get it as JSON. And so what I want to be able to do is take this sort of raw data, which is how it would come back, comes back directly from the database, the St. Louis Fed database. I want to be able to use this instead of having to go through all those steps with Mr. Data Converter, right? Because if I can write code that transforms this JSON into the thing that I need, well then I've just reduced by 3 or 4 the number of manual steps that need to be performed in order to get my visualization to render. And of course, that's what we're always trying to do, is automate things that can be automated, which leaves us more time to spend on things that can't be automated. So as you may have noticed both from the name of it and from its format, JSON is just a JavaScript object. And so I can just do this. I can go ahead and take that. I do need to put a semicolon on the end, but I can actually just paste this into my document as a variable, right? I have all my, quote, all my data. And now you see that the actual data values, the 1929 and the 1065, et cetera, is in this array called observations. So, but as I noted before, this has a lot of information in it that I don't need. I don't need this real-time start thing. I don't need real-time end. I just need date and value, right? I need to create an array of arrays that just has the date and the value in the format that the Google Visualizations is expecting it if I want to be able to use this data. So hopefully this starts to make clear why we worry about things like for loops. So here I'm going to start by I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I need to make an array, as we did when we were sorting candies, where I can place the information that I created that's in the correct format. So I'm going to say my data array, right? Create an empty array. Next, I want to say create a for loop, and I'm just going to use I again. Whoops, not O, I, right? I is less than. Now here's a tricky thing. Boy. There are a lot of items here, and I really do not want to be responsible for having to count them one by one. That would be a big pain. So instead, I want to take advantage of the fact that there is always, sorry, this is really ugly to look at in a moment, that one thing that we know about lists is that a list always has some number of items in it, right? And so just the same way that, a real object like a box, a physical object, well, it has a width and a height, right? It has certain properties that are a part of it, that are naturally a part of it. And in the case of a list, there's a natural property, which is the length. So rather than saying, go up to some number that I have counted, I can actually just say, all my data, right? And now I need to say, it's actually, the part that I need of that is a property called observations. And if you look back, as you're watching this, if you look back, you'll notice that observations is actually the array of values that I'm worried about. Dot length, okay? And that's gonna say, look, go up to however long this thing is. And because we started at 0, it will be 1 less, but it works out math-wise, okay? So there's my for loop. And if I've done this correctly, I can just do a console log and say all my data.observations I, right? And if all is well, I'm going to still see the same visualization because I haven't changed that yet, but in my console, I should actually see each item print out one by one. Okay, so I click on console and I load this. And whoo, there we go. So I can see that my data is loading, it's processing, everything's looking pretty well. Now what I need to do is, well, first of all, I think hopefully you all will note that I need to say I want to create a placeholder variable to point to this because I've written it already twice and I'm probably going to end up writing it a bunch more otherwise. Okay, and so I can say, now these are terrible variable names. So you all need to make better ones. And now what I want to do is create, so what I have is I have a big array, which is my data array, and each item in that is actually an array unto itself. So I'm going to say my item is an empty array, whoops, is an empty array. And then the first part of that little array, right, again, if we look here, we can see, look, the first part is the date, the second part is the value. So I'm going to say, okay, my item push my obs I dot date, right? And I know this because I look up and I see that date is here, and then the other part is called value. I'm going to say, okay, first do the date, and then I say my obs I dot value, right? And then I'm going to say take that item and push it onto the larger array. So I'm going to say my data array, push my item. And at the end of this, if everything has gone well, I should have an array of arrays in that my data array variable. And again, we'll go through all this in a more sort of step-by-step way in class, but hopefully you can see that I basically say, look, give me a placeholder for the big list. Now I'm going to loop through, and for every one of these objects, I'm just going to pull out the date and the value and make a small 2-item list, right? And then I'm going to add each of those 2-item lists back to this large list so that I get that list of lists, which looks something like this. And again, I'm going to come here and I'm going to reload. And because I'm on a Mac, it's sort of doing this whole collapsing thing, but it looks pretty good. Now, so instead of having all this junk here, right, I can go ahead and just say, hey, I have this array of arrays. I have it in a variable, right? Again, this is why we love variables. And I'm just going to say, look, that's what I want you to make. And I'm going to comment on my console log. This is what I want you to make the my data array out of. This is what I want you to make the chart out of. And so with any luck, if I come back here and reload it, problem. Okay, so, and I'm getting this really weird location for it because this is it's actually the Google library that I loaded that's complaining right now. It's like, I don't understand. So again, it's worth trying to attempt to read the English in these things to see if it like offers us some clues. So it says type mismatch. Value 106.5.9 does not match type number in column index 1. Okay, so just like rows, columns start counting at 0. And so what we see is that this add column, we've said, okay, so this is the first one we added, which would be index 0. The second one we added, which is index 1, it says, look, this is supposed to be a number. But if we look back at our data, we see that it's actually in double quotes. And of course, double quotes means string. Now, fortunately, we have a way to force the issue. And that is one of the reasons why we don't tend to use data type descriptions in naming variables, or we don't use them straight up. And it's because we're going to do something called, and Joanna may correct me on this, I believe this is technically casting, or might be called forcing. But you see how number turned purple? It turned purple because it is a data type descriptor. And when I do this and I say number and I put something in round parentheses, again, basically what I'm doing is saying to a built-in recipe in JavaScript, take this string that right now is a string, but I know it has number data in it, I know it has digits in it, take that and convert it from a string to a number. And in doing so, I make the value, I make the data type of this, which is a string, actually into a number so that it matches the data type here. And now hopefully if I reload this page, ta-da! Now, obviously, the descriptors for this are no longer accurate, right? This isn't slices, it's GDP. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on here. But I've gone, a good part of the way towards shortening the process to updating my data, right? Because I was able to copy this straight off of the Fred website in its existing format and skip those steps with the text file and Mr. Data Converter. I've made this sort of even faster than it would be otherwise. In the next segment, we're going to look at how we can actually make this even faster and more sensible so that actually when new data is added, I don't even have to do anything at all, which is really exciting. All right, we'll see you back here in a minute.